Hello, this is Black Thought. I'm your host, Dr. Hutchinson, and we are glad and pleased to have with us today Mr. Walter Fields, who is the president and who is the editor of the North Star News, which is located in New Jersey, and it is our pleasure to have this conversation with him today. Good to see you, my brother.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you. It's great seeing you.
All right, well, now, let's get into it. Even though you're in North Jersey, you have a national scope. You have various persons who do some writing for the paper. Talk to us about how you got into journalism and what the focus of your paper is.
Well, Doctor, I really got into journalism as an undergraduate student at Morgan State University. As a student government leader, I started to write opinion pieces that the Baltimore Afro-American would run. And that was really my introduction, as well as writing for Morgan State's paper, The Spokesman. And from there, I've just had a long career writing and being on television and radio for a number of different mediums. I was one of the original contributors when MSNBC first launched. I was one of their original political contributors and also wrote for MSNBC.com. Been a columnist for newspapers. I've been an editor of a magazine, a publisher of a magazine, and NorthstarNews.com is an online public affairs website focused on the African American community, on politics and public policy, that was launched in 2002 after myself and one of my partners, Rob Tarver, who was also on MSNBC, and he was a court TV anchor also. We just felt that as African Americans we had to embrace this new technology because this is where journalism was going, and we thought that our community needed to be ahead of the crowd. And so we created this website that talks about national issues, but also focuses on those things that are affecting all of us in all of our communities. Because as you know, what's going on in New Jersey is the same thing that's going on in Memphis, is the same thing that's going on in Charlotte and Atlanta. So we try to cover the nation, but focus on those issues of concern to the black community.
Exactly, and we met through the technological medium, and it's been a blessing, even though our paths have crossed, as we talked earlier, in other places, but glad to make your acquaintance this way. But let me ask you a couple of questions, and I hope that this is the beginning of just a periodic touching base through the medium of technology. Wanted to talk to you about the March on Washington, the 50th anniversary. The one that happened on that Saturday, as well as the one that happened on the Wednesday, and where we are as a people. Given your background, because there are a lot of people that pretend to be political pundits, but you actually have done the work in it. Kind of talk to us about what you saw during these commemorations and where we are as a people.
Well, it was a very interesting week of commemorations of what I call the granddaddy of civil rights protests, the 1963 March on Washington. And, I was somewhat disappointed by both events on the Saturday and Wednesday. I think that what the events that we held a week ago really represent is it shows the distance that we've come from really having an organized collective movement. In 1963, what you saw was a panorama of co-equal civil rights organizations. Many of them didn't necessarily agree on ideology or strategy, but they agreed on purpose and goal. And they came together and worked collectively. And so on August 28, 1963, while we remember Dr. King's speech, there were also speeches by Whitney Young and Roy Wilkins, all powerful leaders in their own right, John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph. What I think we missed out on, in our commemoration, number one, I don't think we have the vision and the purpose anymore. And I think on the Saturday commemoration, which really ended up being sort of a National Action Network event, Reverend Sharpton's organization, I was a bit disturbed because we saw civil rights veterans who actually were part of that struggle in 1963, Julian Bond and Reverend Jesse Jackson, who were literally run off the stage. They were interrupted by music. They weren't even able to complete their remarks. And I think it showed how far we have fallen as a people. Because if there's one thing we've always done, we've always respected our elders. And I thought that was very disrespectful to both of those men who I consider to be giants in the civil rights community.
And then I may interrupt. It wasn't the Grammy Awards, so you didn't need the music.
Well, you didn't need the music. Exactly. And it was sort of like Showtime at the Apollo, you know, amateur hour, where, you know, they chase you off stage. And I'm watching this saying to myself, is this where we are as a people? That two people who have, no matter what you might think about them personally, no one can dispute the fact that Julian Bond and Jesse Jackson have dedicated their lives to the cause of justice for black people.
Exactly.
And for them to be treated in that way early on in that program just sent the wrong message. And I think there were too many messages in that Saturday commemoration. I think they tried to do too much. It was not focused. And I don't think people really left there with a sense of mission as folks left D.C. in 1963.
Exactly.
And then the Wednesday commemoration, which was sort of the official government acknowledgement of the 63 March on Washington, where you had a number of members of Congress and you also had, you know, the president speak. I was anticipating President Obama's remarks because I wrote a piece on NorthstarNews.com prior to that Wednesday saying that I was hoping that what President Obama would do once and for all is acknowledge the fact that not only does racism still persist in America, but that the African American community is still disproportionately harmed by racism, particularly structural racism, institutional racism. What I heard from the president instead, though, was sort of this lecture again. And it was a lecture talking about personal responsibility. And why I think that was inappropriate is because, number one, I think African Americans have been the most responsible Americans that this country has had. We suffered through slavery, through Jim Crow. We never acted out. The riots were an aberration. It was an episode of sheer frustration on the part of blacks. We have abided by the law. We have fought in wars and come back home and been discriminated against. We have attained college educations, graduate degrees, and been discriminated against. We've been discriminated against by police. Yet and still, we're the ones being talked to about being personally responsible. What I wanted to hear about was the responsibility of this nation to us. When does the time arrive? And that's what Dr. King talked about in August 1963. Forget the I Have a Dream part of that speech. Dr. King really laid down the gauntlet to America, and it was an indictment of this country's treatment of African Americans. I wanted the first African American president to mimic the courage of Martin Luther King Jr. on the official 50th anniversary, and I really came away disappointed.
Well, let me say this. I was disappointed, but for a different reason. I think that he is not a prophet. He's a politician. He's the first African-American president. And that would have been a good time to say, you know, here is a direction that the country must take to address this issue of racism that is not gone away. And that's what he didn't do. He wasn't called upon to be the prophet of the nation. We had the prophet of the nation.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it would have been appropriate for the president to address the nation and detail what he was going to do as president to move us further down the road towards justice and equality. He should have sent a message to Congress. You know, we just had a Supreme Court that did some damage to the cause of civil rights. It would have been great had the president even spoke to that and said, as president, I'm going to move forward so that we undo the damage that was done by our Supreme Court, that we're going to restore voting rights, that we're going to make sure that individuals have the right to file employment discrimination claims when they've been retaliated against, that we're going to protect affirmative action. We didn't get anything from the president on those important matters that you're absolutely right. He's not the prophet. He's the president. He wasn't even presidential on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And I think it sent to me a very disturbing sign that we are at a point in time now that we're almost back to where we were pre-1963. That we better understand that we better build a movement in this country that's not dependent upon any elected official, as those folks back in the early 1960s understood, that's not dependent upon whether we have an African American who sits in the Oval Office and is president. We really need to rebuild a movement for justice in this country.
And to add to that, as I discussed with you, I came to this broadcast and to our conversation from a meeting in which there were some elected officials, and there was an elected official that is our complexion who basically stood up and said, this is why what you seek can't happen. And we were talking about the closing of a school. Now, maybe I flunked civics class. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. But in civics class, I learned that the politician who was elected by the people is supposed to do the will of the people, not tell the people that something can happen, but they're to find out how it can happen and how they can do the mandate of the people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think what our elected officials are missing today is that they're public servants.
Exactly.
And too many of them are serving themselves. And so I think what we really need to do as part of this new movement, it has to be a new movement of accountability. So we have to begin holding those that we elect accountable and reminding them that their job is temporary, that at any point in time we can vote them out. And too many of them gotten too comfortable being in positions of power and not serving our community, and to have the audacity to tell people that elected him that you can't do this when his job is to serve the will of the people. So I think, part of what we have to do is also address those in leadership who now seem to have abandoned the very community that supported them and put them in power.
Exactly. Now, let me kind of also segue into another area that I want to cover with you. But before we do that, let me tell our listeners the difference between what the president did for this commemoration and what he said concerning Trayvon Martin. The reason my critique is different on that is that he has the Justice Department that's supposed to be doing his work. So there's not much he could have said in terms of a forward thrust on that. So he did set the bar high and say some things that needed to be said for the general nation. So to me, that was different. That
was much different, and I think he spoke with clarity. And I don't know if it was an emotional response for that moment, because it was such an emotional moment when the verdict came down.
Mm-hmm.
But he did speak with strength.
That's right.
To the experiences of African Americans, particularly black men. And it was sort of, and I applauded that moment when he said that, because it was pretty remarkable to hear a president of the United States speak in that manner to something that we all experience in our lives.
Exactly. But now let's segue into Syria. That is the hot topic of the moment. I've read some of your pieces. I kind of know where you're coming from on this. But I want to give you an opportunity to share with us Syria. What should we be doing in terms of Syria?
Well, I think the first thing we should be doing is talking to our allies and developing a plan that has the support of our allies in the United Nations. I'm really disturbed with this go it alone attitude that the president is presenting to the nation. And it really does remind me sort of the arrogance of President Bush going into Iraq, another war an invasion that I strongly oppose, as I do this use of military force in Syria. The other problem in Syria is that, like Iraq, we don't really have an understanding of this country, really of this region. And to go into this country and suggest that it's going to be a limited strike, it's never a limited operation when the United States military gets involved. And I'm really fearful that by striking Syria, as with invading Iraq, we are getting ready to open a Pandora's box. And we will find ourselves sort of in a situation that, number one, we're not prepared to deal with. Number two, our intelligence was faulty in Iraq. How many times did we hear that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? They finally had to admit that they didn't exist. And now we're hearing about all of these chemical plants around Syria based upon U.S. intelligence. And my real fear is that we will bomb Syria, and if those plants do exist, we don't know where they are, and we will hit one of those plants, and we will kill thousands of innocent people. Mm-hmm. And I think, part of the irony of having the president participate in a commemoration of Dr. King, in the March on Washington, is that most people talk about Dr. King, but they don't really understand who Martin Luther King Jr. was. And so to take this aggressive act suggests to me that the man that you say that you admire, you haven't really spent any time studying. Because if Dr. King were alive, he'd be the first one saying, he'd be the first one opposing U.S. military action in Syria. So, I think as Americans, we really need to begin to rein our government in because the world is watching. And I think what we learned by going into Iraq is the damage that we can cause a country when we go in with the arrogance that we're going to be sort of the moral police. We can't even take care of business at home. We have bloodshed in our cities every day. In Newark, New Jersey, just yesterday, there was the 10th murder in 10 days. We can't stop the killing in our own cities, let alone stop the killing in a foreign nation. So I'm really disturbed by the president's decision to go into Syria. I think he will get congressional approval. And I think, once again, it's going to be one of these episodes that our nation will learn that it was a bad decision by its president.
Well, to also make your point a different way, I think this is a decision predicated on finance. Because you have to ask yourself the question, why is John Boehner all of a sudden ready to back the president? This is the same John Boehner that probably couldn't agree with the president that there needed to be a bathroom break for Congress. But now all of a sudden, he wants to say, yes, let's do this. So there's a lot of money in that region. It's political. You have resources. And so this causes me to raise a question. And tell me what you think about this. One of the most mineral-rich countries on planet Earth is the country that was formerly known as Zaire in Central Africa. And one of the most mineral-rich regions of that country is the Eastern Congo. In the Eastern Congo right now, there is a civil war being enacted by this gentleman named General Kony. But it seems like there's no intervention. There's no mass conversation about it. We have missiles that if we found him, we can blow him until Jesus comes back. But there's no concerted effort to go into that area. But we have effort to go into Syria, where we're probably not as sure that we'll be able to execute what we wish. It's just interesting to me.
Well, I think the lesson from Iraq is that we always have to be concerned about ulterior motives. Mm-hmm. And the challenge in the United States today, when you have sort of the rallying around the flag for warfare, we saw what that got us in Iraq. People need to remember that there was little opposition in Congress to invading Iraq. And we went into Iraq, and it was just a sheer hellhole for this country. We spent trillions of dollars, thousands of U.S. soldiers killed, hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians killed. So when you look at the decision to go into a country, you really do have to question whether there are ulterior motives at play. And I think that's why, as American citizens, we have to hold our government accountable. Exactly. Anytime you have a government that's ready to go to war, we should put on the brakes, because I think we've learned some lessons in the past, not just Iraq, but Vietnam. We fought 2 decades in Vietnam, and basically was lied to about Vietnam. And it derailed the progress we were making on civil rights because it bankrupted our country. So here we are at a time of high unemployment, long-term joblessness, just problem after problem. But yet and still, our focus is on Syria.
That's interesting. What you've said is very interesting. But now, let me close out this session by getting into this. Many who hear this might have the feeling that we are anti-President Obama. And for the record, I'm not. I supported him. I'm not anti-Obama. But I also recognize that President Obama is not Jesus. I recognize that he's not Moses. I recognize that he's none of those people. I recognize that really he is the first. So there's something to be said for what happens to the first. And he is also a symbol of what can be. And so if there's some disappointment in what he has been, I'm only disappointed because I may have wished for some additional things to happen, but I didn't have Pollyanna glasses on. I knew what I was getting in this president. That's not to knock him. It's just to be a realist. He wasn't going to be the brother man president, which is what some people wanted.
Well, absolutely. And I think the greatest triumph of the civil rights movement is to have the first African-American president and to treat him as the president.
Yes,
so we're not treating him any differently than we treat any other president. I think that's what the civil rights movement was about.
Exactly.
And so we can celebrate the historic nature of his election, but he's still the president of the United States. He still represents the United States government. We still have a responsibility, we the people, of holding him accountable as the president of the United States. And if we fail to do that, then we failed what all those people showed up for on August 28th, 1963 for. We failed the test. So we have to hold the president accountable as we held previous presidents, and we have to support him when he's right, and when he's wrong, we have to tell him that he's wrong.
Exactly. And one thing we didn't cover, which we may have to cover at a later point, is in 50 years, all of the economic indicators have barely moved. The needle has barely budged in many areas.
And some have gotten worse. And part of what I wrote about on our website, I said, our goal should be that we don't have a March on Washington in 50 years.
Exactly. That's a good goal. Well, we're going to leave it here. We have with us today, Walter Fields, who is from the NorthStarNews.com. We're grateful to you, and I pray that this is the beginning of a great relationship in this way. We look forward to hearing from you in the future. We will also post a link for those of you who are watching on our Facebook page, MUTV1 Black Thought, so you'll be able to read the commentary and the other pieces from this brother in his great newspaper. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
All right, this is Black Thought, and I'm your host, Dr. Hutchinson.